Well, the house, as far as we know, on official record, it was built in 1796 by Ichabod Benton Miller, a young surveyor. We believe, because of the wording on the land warrant, it could have been built actually in 1795, which makes it, of course, 220 years old, thereabouts. Ichabod Benton Miller, the house, of course, is named for him. He was a young surveyor who came down the Ohio River from Fort Pitt. He met over in Columbia on the other side of the river in the Sims Purchase in Columbia, which was a settlement over on that side. He met a young lady named Sarah Mercer, and they got married. And he and his father-in-law bought the 600 acres that this log house now sits on from the heir of Captain Matthew Jewett, John Jewett, who didn't want to move here after the war after his father died. So young Ichabod, if I remember correctly, bought 400 acres or 441 for 50 cents an acre at $220, and his father-in-law bought the remaining balance of the 600 acres, and he had his son lay out a town called Mercersburg, which, of course, he had a station over where Jones Fish Hatchery is today. A station back in those days was basically a fortified log house surrounded by a stockade. And when the settlers would come, it was a safe place for them to stay until they could contract with a surveyor to find land, and that they would of course buy at that point.
I started coming out and doing the research, reading the information on the log house, and then I realized, well, my family didn't own the house at the time my father talked about who was born here. So I knew there was a family connection, but I didn't exactly know how until I did further study, and then I determined that it was in fact the grandparents of the people my father talked about who actually owned the house, Ichabod Benton Miller. But he owned this house, he built this house, again around 1796, although there's some indication it could have been 1795. The township actually began in 1793. It might have been dangerous to live here before then. But anyway, he rented the house to one of my relatives, and that was James Noble and his wife Tabitha Pardue. Now, the story on the Noble family is they came from North Carolina. They stopped in Kentucky for a couple years around Lexington, and then they moved to Bethel. They're in the 1820 census in Bethel, Ohio. And then we knew originally from records many years ago that they were here in the house by 1830, because they're in the Anderson Township census in 1830.
The house itself, if you had enough men, women, and horses, you could build a house like this pretty much in one day. But the rule of thumb was 4 men, 3 days to build a house like this. So when you wanted to build a house like this, obviously you had to determine a good place to put it. You wanted some running water. Over there's Clough Creek. Clough Creek is named after Richard Clough Anderson, the deputy surveyor of the Virginia Military District. Of course, the township is as well. But that would be your source of water, and also rock for the root cellar. So essentially you would identify the house floor plan with 4 large stones. You would dig out the root cellar, of course, line the walls. We still have an earthen packed floor, as always been there. And then, of course, you would start marking the trees that you wanted to use for the building of this house. And before doing all that, you would put a word out within the community at church meetings and other social functions that you were going to build a house. You needed to hire 2 cornermen and as many helpers, of course, as you could get your hands on. So people would, of course, show up at some point in time, not all together, but let's just assume, for example, there were 4 men, 3 days. At the end of every day, these men were obviously fed. At the end of the building of the house, there was a big party. The cornermen were generally paid for their services. In those days, money wasn't so common in this part of the country because there was nowhere to spend the money. So it was generally agreed that it would either be bartered for services rendered back, or in other times they would pay them with corn. And when I say corn, I don't mean ears of corn or bags of grain, I mean liquid corn. The house itself, the main part of the house, is 1795. Right now, if you were looking at the house, the chinking that holds the logs together is actually cement. In 1990, we replaced some of the logs, replaced all the mud chinking with cement, just of course to last longer. When the house was like this was built, after 3 days, essentially what you would have is a structure that looks something like this. And you would have to fill in those gaps.
So it's nice to know that where the residents of my family lived, and I can walk in the house and go through the area and imagine that this was how they lived their life.